This is Criminal Interrupted. Today, we dive into a case that sounds right out of a crime novel, specifically, one written by the killer herself. This is the story of Nancy Crampton Brophy, a self-published romance novelist who once wrote a now infamous essay titled How to Murder Your Husband. On June 2nd, 2018, students at the Oregon Culinary Institute walked into class expecting to see their instructor, Chef Dan Brophy, ready to greet them. Instead, they found him lying on the kitchen floor, shot dead. What began as a shocking tragedy quickly unraveled into one of the most bizarre true crime cases in recent memory. I don't want to be one of those people, but I am going to be today. Please follow me on your favorite platform. I would really appreciate your support. I am currently jobless as I have a heart condition, and all I have really right now to focus on is this podcast. I'm really enjoying bringing this content for you all and would love to continue to do so. Also, side note, if I sound really snuffly and nasally, it's because I've got terrible hay fever and it decided to start right before I began this episode. Now, on to the story itself. Nancy Lee Crampton was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, on June 16th, 1950. She came from a family of lawyers and trailblazers. She was the middle child in her family to parents Roger and Barbara, who were partners at the same firm. Her mum, Barbara, was actually the only third woman to ever practice law in the entire city. Growing up, Nancy was clearly a high achiever, a fact cemented when she graduated with honors from Wichita Falls High School in 1968. She then pursued her studies in economics at the University of Houston. It was during college that she began to write, but writing wasn't the only thing she became known for. She was a student activist, promoting women's health to anyone and everyone who would listen, a topic that simply wasn't being openly talked about in the 1970s. She founded a group called the Population Awareness Committee and started passing out condoms on campus while actively persuading the university administrators to provide free birth control services at the student clinic. Later on, the Dean of Students credited her with being one of the key students who convinced them to hire the university's first gynecologist for female students. But passing out condoms around campus wasn't the only thing she did to promote student health. Nancy's first book publication as a writer was called Between Your Navel and Your Knees. It was initially just a capstone project for one of her sociology classes, but it turned out to be so much more than that. It was a student-focused health pamphlet that talked about everything from birth control pills, IUDs, and vasectomies to ineffective birth control techniques, grouped under the heading, Surefire Ways to Get Pregnant. No one at the university had seen anything like it. It was both educational and funny. The whole thing was different and unique, and it talked about important health issues in a way that only college kids would understand and appreciate. After receiving copies of it, the university's student governing body decided to allocate over $1,600 toward printing the 44-page booklet. About 3 weeks later, all 8,000 copies were gone, leading to a second printing. The release got so much attention that it even triggered an investigation from a Texas state lawmaker who accused the then 22-year-old Nancy of promoting abortion. At the time, abortion was illegal in Texas, and unfortunately still is. So when lawmakers heard that Nancy was telling students they could reach out to their local Planned Parenthood and scheduled to have one done in a different state, like California or New York, they tried getting in her way. She told a Houston Post reporter in March 1972, quote, "Pregnancy is like dying. It's not real to most girls. Most college students just don't believe it will happen to them," end quote. She also did interviews for local newspapers, Women's Day magazines, and a few television shows. Although most of this information is probably outdated today, The original copy is still available at the University of Houston Student Library. It featured the same type of satirical humour she would use in some of her novels many years later. After graduating from college, she worked in real estate and moved back to her hometown, where she met and married a police officer named Joe. She met him through her mum, who was a criminal defense attorney, and Joe worked for her as an investigator. They were both young and quickly fell in love, eloping just 6 months after meeting. However, the relationship didn't last. The two eventually split up and went their separate ways after Joe moved away from graduate school, and they couldn't make the long-distance relationship work. Looking for a fresh start, the then 40-year-old Nancy decided to pack her bags and move from Texas to Oregon in 1990. When she got there, she decided it was also time to switch careers. So she enrolled at what used to be called the Oregon Culinary Institute, which now goes by Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts in Portland. She now had her mind set on becoming a chef, and that's where she met Dan Brophy, the man who would become her husband for the next 27 years, and ultimately the subject of her most infamous real-life crime. Like Nancy, Dan had previously been married and had a son. However, that marriage fell apart and they divorced in 1994, leading to a period of estrangement from his son that would only be resolved years later. When Nancy met him, Dan was a first-year instructor and Nancy was his student. Although he was the teacher, she was almost exactly 4 years older than him. Dan was born on June 27, 1954, and Nancy was born 4 years and 9 days earlier on June 16, 1950. At first, they were just casual friends, a new culinary student and a first-year instructor. But somewhere along the way, they became more than friends and started dating, despite being complete opposites. Dan was described as quiet, reserved, and a homebody. Nancy, as we've established, couldn't be more different. She was very outgoing, active, and loud. Yet there was something that drew them together. Nancy later told friends that one of the first things that stood out about Dan was his intelligence. Dan's intelligence stretched far beyond the kitchen. When he wasn't teaching culinary classes, he read books about marine biology and composting. In fact, despite being an accomplished chef, he also held a degree in marine biology. His friends universally described him as a, quote, no waste kind of guy, end quote. He was so passionate about sustainability that he even made sure the culinary school's extra food went to the homeless people in the area. They also recall that he was an avid beekeeper, a master gardener, and an expert at foraging and cooking edible mushrooms, and always on the lookout for the latest cooking trends. 8 years after first meeting, they tied the knot in 1999, putting on a large wedding ceremony for all their family and friends. As a married couple, they bought a large 4-bedroom house together in the suburbs. From that moment, they were supposed to live happily ever after. But just like most marriages, they had their own set of challenges over the years, one of the biggest being money. Dan continued to work as a culinary instructor, earning between $50,000 and $60,000 a year. Nancy initially ran a catering business in Northwest Portland for 10 years, which turned out to be very successful, at least initially. According to their 1999 tax return documents, the business earned around $500,000 the previous year. But this success took a dramatic turn in 2001. Instead of making almost $500,000, the business started laying off employees. By September of 2001, the staff had dropped from 25 full-time employees to only 15. Not long after that, Nancy sold the company entirely in the early 2000s. Outside of the catering and culinary world, Nancy kept up with her writing hobby. By 2003, she joined her local chapter of the Romance Writers of America. That's when she started taking it seriously, moving past trade journals and into complete fictional novels. Her Amazon author profile stated her style as, quote, her stories are about pretty men and strong women, about families that don't always work, and about the joy of finding love and the difficulty of making it stay, end quote. She wrote titles like The Wrong Lover and, most notably, The Wrong Husband. Most of her books explored themes of cheating spouses, star-crossed lovers, and police procedure. But while Nancy may have enjoyed writing these fictional romance novels, eventually publishing 9 of them, they weren't exactly paying the bills. Even with book sales, it wasn't nearly enough to make ends meet. They still relied on Dan's teacher's salary to try and keep up with the mortgage payments on the house. And even then, that didn't seem to be enough. Month after month, they were spending a lot more than what they were making. At one point, their finances were so bad that Dan had to go out and get a second job on the weekend while he still taught Monday through Friday. Nancy also started selling insurance plans to family and friends as a side hustle. The financial pressure was mounting, and it was during this period that Nancy published the piece of writing that would forever define her public image, an essay that examined the perfect, untraceable crime. What was the title? How to Murder Your Husband. The essay, written in the form of a brainstorming exercise for writers, immediately set a provocative and self-aware tone. She wrote, quote, "As a romantic suspense writer, I spend a lot of time thinking about murder and, consequently, about police procedure. After all, if the murder is supposed to set me free, I certainly don't want to spend any time in jail. And let me say clearly, for the record, I don't like jumpsuits and orange is not my color." End quote. Nancy begins by laying out the motives. She says every good story needs them, and in her view, the motives for killing a spouse could include financial gain, like life insurance or inheritance, infidelity, betrayal by a partner, or revenge, retaliation for abuse or mistreatment. She wrote, quote, "Divorce is expensive, and do you really want to split your possessions? Or if you married for money, aren't you entitled to all of it? The drawback is that the police aren't stupid. They're looking at you first, so you have to be organized, ruthless, and very clever." End quote. She also detailed methods weighing the pros and cons of various murder weapons. Knives were dismissed as, quote, "really personal, blood everywhere, ew." Poison, she wrote, was, quote, "considered a woman's weapon," end quote, but added that it was too easy to trace. She noted that guns were, quote, "loud, messy, required some skill. If it takes 10 shots for the sucker to die, either you have terrible aim or he's on drugs," end quote. Hiring a hitman? Possible, but expensive and risky. Staging an accident, which she suggests might be the cleverest way because it avoids suspicion. She also considered hiring a lover to do the deed, but dismissed that idea as the lover might turn around on her. Throughout the essay, Nancy keeps a darkly comedic tone. She frames it as playful, almost like she's brainstorming crime-writing tropes for her novels. But when you read it today, knowing what came later, it feels like satire and more like foreshadowing. Ultimately, she concluded the article by stating, quote, "I find it easier to wish people dead than to actually kill them. But the thing I know about murder is that every one of us has it in him or herself when pushed far enough." End quote. It's important to note this essay was not admitted as evidence during her trial. The judge ruled it would be prejudicial, but prosecutors still pointed to it publicly, saying it showed her mindset. So in How to Murder Your Husband, Nancy Crampton Brophy wrote about motives like money, betrayal, and revenge. She joked about methods, gun, knives, poison, hitmen, and accidents, and she wrapped it all in a satirical tone. But years later, those words would haunt her. On June 2nd, 2018, students at the now-closed Oregon Culinary Institute arrived on campus to start their day of classes. Normally, their instructor, 63-year-old chef Dan Brophy, would be standing at the door, ready to greet them with a smile. But that morning was different. Instead of a warm welcome, they found him lying on the kitchen floor, unresponsive. At first, when police arrived, they thought Dan had suffered a heart attack. Officers even began CPR, but then they noticed blood on their hands. This was no medical emergency. Dan had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the chest. Within minutes, word spread. News vans crowded the streets, cameras were rolling, as crime scene tape sealed off the 3-block radius. From the very beginning, Dan's death was treated as a homicide. Detectives quickly notified his wife, Nancy, and called her down to the culinary school. Officers told her that her husband had been shot to death inside his classroom. Their first question was simple. Does she know anyone who might want him dead? Nancy said absolutely not. Dan was someone everyone liked. Their second question was where her whereabouts were that morning. Nancy claimed she'd been at home writing all day. Some reports suggest she told police she was walking her dogs and later showered. Either way, she denied ever going near the culinary school. Investigators pressed further. Did Dan own a gun? Nancy admitted that earlier that year, after the Parkland school shooting in Florida, she and Dan had purchased a Glock 9mm at a gun show. They thought it might provide protection, but quickly regretted the decision. She said they had never loaded it, never used it, and it simply sat in the house untouched. Detectives then escorted Nancy home to check if the gun was still there. It was. But here's where police made a critical mistake. They never tested Nancy's hand for gunshot residue. At that point, she wasn't considered a suspect. By nightfall, the entire community knew about Dan's murder. Friends, colleagues, and family were devastated, but no one knew why. Who would want to kill a man like Dan Brophy? Investigators began combing through his devices. His phone, his tablet. On the tablet, they found something strange. A search for 10 ways to cover up a murder. Why would Dan be looking at that? Or was someone else using his device? The crime scene itself offered few clues. Dan had arrived at 7:22 a.m., deactivating the school alarm. He was wearing his chef's uniform. The autopsy confirmed he had been shot twice at close range with a Glock 9mm. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. 2 shell casings were recovered, but no fingerprints. The kitchen sink was still running, suggesting he had been caught off guard while preparing his morning iced coffee. Detectives theorized the killer walked up behind him, fired into his back, then delivered a second shot to the chest to ensure he wouldn't survive. Oddly, all of Dan's possessions were still with him. His wallet contained cash, his credit cards and ID were intact, and his iPhone was still in his pocket. Robbery wasn't the motive. Police interviewed students, considering whether an angry pupil might have lashed out, but nothing pointed in that direction. They even considered whether a homeless person in the area might have attacked him. Dan had an outreach program to provide food to the homeless, but again, there was no evidence. Whoever killed Dan hadn't taken a thing. This was personal. The school had no working surveillance cameras, but detectives checked nearby businesses. Across the street, a pizza shop had a functioning security system. Reviewing the footage, they narrowed in on a critical window, between 7:22 a.m. when Dan arrived and 7:30 a.m. when students walked in. The video was grainy, but one vehicle stood out. An old model silver minivan, the same kind Nancy drove. It was seen near the school at 6:39 a.m. and again at 7:08 a.m., just minutes before Dan arrived. This raised immediate red flags. Nancy had insisted she was at home all morning, but now her van appeared to be right outside the culinary school at the exact time her husband was murdered. As detectives dug deeper into the murder of Dan Brophy, the picture of his wife Nancy began to shift. Outwardly, she was the grieving widow, but behind the scenes, her actions raised suspicion. Nancy told a friend that while her name was on the deed to their house, it wasn't on the mortgage. That meant the bank could run a credit check to see if she could afford the payments on her own. Without Dan's steady income from the culinary school, she couldn't. Her book sales were inconsistent, and her small insurance side hustle barely brought in money. So she told friends she wanted to sell the house quickly. Detectives wondered if that urgency was about more than just finances. Meanwhile, investigators kept circling back to the gun Nancy admitted she and Dan had purchased earlier that year, a Glock 17, the same type of weapon used in the murder. Testing the weapon took months, and when the results finally came back, the ballistics didn't match, but detectives weren't ready to let Nancy off the hook. They returned to surveillance footage. Cameras from nearby businesses showed her silver minivan circling the culinary school the morning of the murder. At one point, a camera captured the driver clearly, a woman who looked exactly like Nancy, alone in the vehicle. The van lingered in the area, even positioning itself on a hill where the driver could watch Dan arrive for work. 15 minutes after the murder, the van drove back toward Nancy and Dan's home. Analysts confirmed the first 3 letters of the license plate matched Nancy's van, along with a distinctive church sticker on the rear window. The evidence was mounting. Detectives searched Nancy and Dan's home. What they found was a treasure trove. Their iTunes accounts were linked, meaning searches on one device appear on the other. That strange search for 10 ways to cover up a murder found on Dan's tablet, it wasn't Dan at all, it was Nancy. They also discovered 2 laptops. On one, investigators found insurance papers and a letter Nancy had written to Dan years earlier, before a surgery. In it, she gave him detailed instructions on what to do if she died, how to access her Facebook account, how to sell the house, how to use insurance money, even how to finish publishing her final book. At face value, it looked like a loving gesture. But detectives questioned why the letter was lying out in the open years after the surgery had already happened. Was it really meant for Dan, or was Nancy now planning to use those instructions herself after his death? Financial records revealed even more. Early in the investigation, Nancy told police she and Dan had about $40,000 in life insurance policies, but that was a lie. In reality, they had closer to $850,000 in coverage, most of it on Dan's life. Nancy was spending nearly $1,000 a month to keep those policies active, despite their financial struggles. They had already sold a catering business, Dan had taken a second job, and they were barely keeping up with the mortgage. Detectives concluded that if Dan died, Nancy stood to gain everything: the house, the insurance payouts, and financial freedom. So, was Nancy Crampton Brophy a grieving widow, or was she a woman who saw murder as the solution to her problems? The surveillance footage, the gun purchase, the suspicious internet searches, and the mountain of financial evidence all pointed in one direction. Detectives believed Nancy had motive, means, and opportunity, and soon they would have enough to make an arrest. So 3 months after Dan's death, in September 2018, Nancy was taken into custody. Dan Brophy was more to Nancy dead than alive. That's what prosecutors argued. And after 3 months of investigation, they believed they had enough evidence to convince a jury. The security cameras showing her minivan circling the culinary school, the internet searches for ghost guns and spare gun parts, the mountain of life insurance policies, every single clue pointed back to Nancy. And when news of her arrest broke, it shocked almost everyone. Not just because Nancy looked like a sweet grey-haired lady in a cardigan, but because of what she did for a living. She was a romance author, the same author who once wrote an essay called How to Murder Your Husband. And now she was accused of doing exactly that. It was almost like she was living inside one of her own novels. Family and friends quickly picked sides. You were either team innocent or team guilty. There was no middle ground. After multiple delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, Nancy's trial finally began on April 22, 2022, 4 years after her arrest. During all that time, she remained in jail, unable to post bond. But she was determined to clear her name. She pleaded not guilty. And here's where things got interesting. From the very start, her defense attorney announced that Nancy planned to take the stand in her own defense, and that surprised everyone. Most defendants in her position would never risk it. They don't want to face the prosecutor's cross-examination, but Nancy wanted the jury to hear directly from her. Maybe she thought her appearance, a grandmotherly figure, a romance novelist, would sway them, because whether we like to admit it or not, looks can matter in a courtroom. The trial room itself was divided. Dan's family and friends sat behind the prosecution, convinced she was guilty. Nancy's supporters sat behind her, believing she was being framed. And throughout it all, Nancy looked every bit the sweet old lady, not someone capable of cold-blooded murder. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. Their case was simple. Nancy killed Dan because she needed money. Before his death, the couple had withdrawn $35,000 from his retirement account just to catch up on bills. Witness after witness testified about the Brophy's financial struggles. And then, right after Dan died, Nancy filed claims on 10 separate life insurance policies, totaling over $1.4 million. Prosecutors argued she concealed the murder weapon by switching out parts of her Glock pistol. Digital forensic evidence from her laptops backed up their theory. They told the jury that on the morning of June 2nd, 2018, Nancy snuck into the Oregon Culinary Institute, shot Dan as he prepared for class, and then drove home to play the grieving widow. The biggest hurdle for prosecutors was proving she had tampered with the gun. Without that, the jury might hesitate to convict. So they called Brett Glendinning, the gun salesman who sold Nancy the Glock. He testified that when customers handled guns at shows, a zip tie was always placed around the slide and barrel. When shown a photo of Nancy's gun, he noticed the slide and barrel weren't seated correctly on the frame. That suggested she had switched out the barrel without breaking the zip tie, exactly how prosecutors believed she concealed the murder weapon. A forensic scientist backed this up, testifying that Dan was likely shot with a Glock pistol, the same type of gun parts Nancy had purchased. It was damning evidence. Now you might be wondering, what about her essay, How to Murder Your Husband? The judge ruled it inadmissible. It had been written 7 years before the murder, and allowing it would unfairly taint the jury's impression of her. So while prosecutors could quote from it, they couldn't mention the title or the fact that Nancy herself had written it. In other words, the jury never knew she had once published a piece describing motives and methods for killing a spouse. Next came the surveillance tapes. Detective Eric McDaniel testified that the minivan seen near the school was a 2004 or 2005 Toyota Sienna. At the time, there were 9 similar vans registered in the area, but none matched the vehicle in the footage except Nancy's, right down to the church sticker on the back window and the first 3 letters of the license plate. And then came perhaps the most dramatic testimony. Andrea Jacobs, a former cellmate of Nancy's, told the court that Nancy had described how Dan was shot. Jacobs said Nancy stretched out her arms to show the distance, saying he was shot twice in the heart. Jacobs even claimed Nancy started to say, "I," before correcting herself to "it." Piece by piece, the prosecution built their case. Financial motive, forensic evidence, surveillance footage, jailhouse admissions. To them, it was clear. Nancy Crampton Brophy had murdered her husband. But would the jury see it the same way? And after weeks of hearing the prosecution's evidence, it was finally the defense's turn. Nancy's lead attorney, Lisa Maxfield, came prepared to present her own story to the jury. She argued that there was nothing suspicious about the life insurance policies. Dan and Nancy had opened multiple policies to protect themselves financially in case one of them died suddenly. And because Nancy was older, it made sense for the most of the policies to be in Dan's name. According to the defense, that's exactly what life insurance is for. They reminded the jury that Nancy collected those claims because that's what they were intended to do. Friends and neighbors testified about the couple's loving relationship, insisting that Nancy couldn't possibly be capable of murder. Yes, the Brophies had financial struggles, but the defense argued they were paying off debts, fixing up their house, and even borrowing from their retirement account, things many families do. Then came the guns. Nancy's lawyer said the purchases weren't about murder, but about research. She was planning a new book, and the plot involved a woman trapped in a dangerous marriage. That character couldn't legally buy a gun, so she turned to ghost guns and replacement parts. Nancy, they argued, was simply doing what writers do, immersing herself in the details to make her fiction believable. Friends from her writing group even testified that they too had bought unusual items for research. But prosecutors countered that Nancy spent over $15,000 on gun parts while struggling to pay her mortgage, and unlike her fellow writers, her husband ended up dead. 6 weeks into the trial came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Nancy herself took the stand. She looked every bit the part of a grandmother. Grey hair, light blue cardigan, calm demeanour. She told the jury she loved her husband, describing him as smart, funny, kind, and humble. She said losing him was like losing an arm, that she functioned, but something vital was missing. She claimed Dan knew about her gun purchases and understood they were for research. She admitted they had financial struggles, but insisted they were working through them. When asked about the surveillance footage showing her van near the school, Nancy said she suffered from retrograde amnesia. She claimed she couldn't remember much of that morning because the trauma of learning her husband had been murdered had erased her memory. Maybe she did drive to the school, she said, but she simply didn't recall. Prosecutors weren't buying it. They called it convenient amnesia. The defense floated other theories. Maybe a homeless man named Oscar Taylor, seen nearby that morning, had killed Dan in a botched robbery. Maybe police mishandled evidence by failing to test bullet casings for DNA. They attacked the credibility of Andrea Jacobs, Nancy's former cellmate, pointing out her criminal history and suggesting she testified against Nancy in exchange for leniency. In short, the defense argued the state's case was circumstantial. No gun parts were ever recovered, no direct forensic evidence tied Nancy to the crime, and she, they insisted, loved her husband too much to kill him. But here's where I want to pause and share my own reaction. I watched the trial footage, I listened to Nancy testify, and honestly, it was so frustrating. She came across as polished, calm, and even likable on the surface, but underneath, it was clear she was manipulating the narrative. The way she spoke, the way she deflected, the way she leaned on amnesia, it felt textbook narcissism. She wanted to control the story, wanted sympathy, and wanted to be seen as the victim. And watching her, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was performing for the jury, not telling the truth. In closing arguments, prosecutors cut through the defense's theories. They told the jury that 6 minutes was all Nancy needed to walk into the Oregon Culinary Institute and fire 2 bullets into her husband's heart. 6 minutes to turn fiction into reality. After 7 long weeks, the case was finally handed to the jury. Deliberations began on May 24, 2022, delayed slightly by a COVID scare in the courtroom, and the question hung heavy in the air, guilty or innocent. Would the jury believe the prosecution's circumstantial case, even without the missing gun parts, or would Nancy's performance on the stand be enough to convince them otherwise? The jury deliberated for more than 2 days. Sometimes when juries take that long, it could be a good sign for the defense. Maybe they're hung up on something, maybe there's doubt, but in Nancy's case, that wasn't the situation. After 2 full days of discussion, the jury returned with an unanimous decision: guilty. Nancy Crampton Brophy was convicted of second-degree murder for killing her husband, Dan Brophy. A few weeks later, she learned her sentence: life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At 71 years old, that means she could spend the rest of her life behind bars. During sentencing, Dan's family had the chance to speak. His son, Nathan Stillwater, delivered a powerful statement. Quote, "The pain you have delivered to us is immeasurable. Your theft of a parent and grandfather for such selfish reasons is unforgivable. You were, to borrow from your catalogue, the wrong wife." End quote. Dan's mother, Karen Brophy, also had her words read aloud by prosecutors. Quote, "We will never understand how you can decide that it was an advantage for you to take the life of our son, that he did not deserve to live. You will never know our beautiful great-grandchildren, Dan's grandchildren. These children deserve to know and love him as we all have." End quote. Listening to those statements, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what Nancy's actions cost. A family robbed of a father, a grandfather, and a son. A community robbed of a beloved teacher, and all of it, prosecutors argued, was for money. The loss of Chef Daniel Brophy was keenly felt throughout the culinary community. Students and colleagues at the Oregon Culinary Institute who had discovered his body that morning mourned the loss of their beloved instructor. He was remembered as a master chef, a resident encyclopedia of knowledge, whose passion for the culinary arts was matched by his compassion. More than 100 people gathered outside the Oregon Culinary Institute soon after the shooting for a candlelight vigil, sharing stories of his stern but humorous teaching style. His friends and students took solace in his legacy, vowing to be better cooks and compassionate human beings because of the impact he had on their lives. The Oregon Culinary Institute later closed, but Daniel Brophy's spirit, a no-waste chef and a heart of gold, lives on in the careers and memories of those he taught. Thank you for listening.